You sit in silence tonight, convinced your thoughts are purely your own. But pause for a moment. Consider the last passionate opinion you held, the last cause that stirred your blood, the last moral position you defended with unwavering certainty. Where did it come from? Not from some divine revelation or personal epiphany, but from a carefully orchestrated symphony of influence that began long before you were aware you were listening. Every belief you cherish, every value you hold sacred, every principle you die for, they've been planted, cultivated, and harvested by architects of perception who understand something you're only beginning to glimpse. The narrative you think you're living isn't your story at all. It's a script written by those who learn to weaponize your deepest human need, the need to belong, to matter, to be part of something greater than yourself. Tonight, you discover the most devastating truth of modern existence. The most powerful force in human society isn't violence, though violence has its place. It isn't money, though money flows through every transaction of power. It's something far more insidious, far more complete. It's the ability to make others believe their submission was their choice. It's the capacity to transform resistance into compliance, rebellion into performance, and independence into a carefully managed illusion of freedom. You've been living inside this illusion your entire life, mistaking the shadows on the cave wall for reality itself. The masters of this craft don't need to force you into compliance. They don't need armies or chains or threats. They simply need to convince you that the cage you're in is actually the world, that the limitations they've imposed are natural laws, that the choices they've predetermined are expressions of your authentic will, and you've believed them. God help you, you've believed them completely. You wake up each morning and participate in rituals you call democracy, choice, self-expression. You cast votes in elections where the outcomes were determined long before your ballot was counted. You champion causes that were designed to channel your dissent into harmless performance. You take moral stances that serve interests you've never examined, defend positions you never consciously chose, and feel righteous fury about issues that were crafted specifically to make you feel powerful while keeping you impotent. The theater of democratic consent is the most sophisticated control mechanism ever devised. It doesn't suppress your will, it redirects it. It doesn't silence your voice, it amplifies it in directions that serve the architects of the narrative. You're told you live in a free society, and you believe it because you're allowed to choose between options that were pre-selected for you. You're given the illusion of rebellion while your every act of resistance follows scripts written by those who profit from your predictable responses. Every vote you cast has been filtered through systems designed to make you feel autonomous while keeping you controllable. Every cause you champion has been focus grouped, market tested, and refined to trigger your emotional responses while serving strategic goals you're not meant to understand. Every moral stance you take has been presented to you as a choice between obvious good and obvious evil, when the real choice, the choice that matters, was made before you even knew there was something to choose. The mask of legitimacy doesn't hide tyranny. It makes tyranny feel like freedom. It transforms oppression into participation, control into collaboration, manipulation into voluntary compliance. And you've been wearing this mask so long you've forgotten there's a face underneath. You've become so accustomed to the weight of it that you mistake its pressure for the natural shape of your own thoughts. But there's something even more insidious at work here. Something that cuts deeper than political manipulation or social control. They've weaponized the very qualities that make you human. Your compassion, your empathy, your desire to help and heal and make things right. These have been turned into control mechanisms, more effective than any external force could ever be. You've been conditioned to believe that kindness is always virtue, that compassion is always appropriate, that your natural empathy is a moral compass that will never lead you astray. But you've never stopped to ask the question that would shatter this illusion. Who benefits when you prioritize others' comfort over your own sovereignty? Who profits when you sacrifice your power to avoid being called cruel? Who gains when you choose to be harmless instead of dangerous? The narrative controllers understand something about good people that good people don't understand about themselves. They're the easiest to manipulate. Not because they're stupid, many of them are brilliant. Not because they're weak, many of them are incredibly strong. But because they've been taught to value being liked over being respected, being comfortable over being effective, being nice over being powerful. They'll give up strategic advantages to maintain their self-image as moral actors. They'll sabotage their own interests to avoid conflict. They'll hand over their power to anyone who knows how to make them feel guilty for wanting to keep it. Your empathy has become a leash. Your compassion has become a collar. Your desire to be good has become the very mechanism by which others control your behavior, direct your energy, and harvest your compliance. You think you're being virtuous, but you're actually being farmed. Your goodness has become a crop that others cultivate for their own benefit. The cruelest irony is that your controllers don't even need to be particularly evil. They just need to be strategic. They need to understand that emotional people make decisions with their wounds, not their wisdom. They need to recognize that people who prioritize being liked will always be vulnerable to those who understand how to withdraw that approval strategically. They need to grasp that individuals who've built their identity around being good will sacrifice almost anything to maintain that identity, including the very power that would allow them to actually do good in the world. Niccolo Machiavelli understood what you're just beginning to see. Moral rigidity is a luxury only the powerless can afford. The Prince wasn't a manual for tyrants. It was a mirror held up to power itself, showing how the world actually works rather than how we wish it worked. Machiavelli saw that those who insist on being virtuous in all circumstances will be destroyed by those who understand when virtue serves and when it hinders. You've been taught to value consistency over effectiveness, principle over results, noble intentions over strategic outcomes. You've been conditioned to believe that how you achieve something matters more than what you achieve, that the purity of your methods is more important than the impact of your actions. But in the arena where narratives are born and die, where the stories that shape civilization are written and rewritten, your attachment to being good makes you predictable. And predictable people never control the story. They become characters in someone else's script. The controllers don't need to be better than you. They just need to be less constrained by the moral frameworks that limit your strategic thinking. While you agonize over whether your actions are pure enough, ethical enough, kind enough, they're simply asking, will this work? While you debate the righteousness of your methods, they're implementing solutions. While you worry about being judged, they're creating the criteria by which judgment itself is made. This doesn't mean abandoning morality. It means understanding that morality without power is just performance. It means recognizing that your principles are meaningless if you lack the strategic capability to implement them. It means accepting that in a world where others play by different rules, your noble intentions will be harvested and redirected by those who understand how to weaponize your virtue against your interests. Your anger isn't spontaneous, it's cultivated. Your outrage isn't organic, it's manufactured. Your righteous fury isn't an expression of your authentic values, it's a response to stimuli that were carefully crafted to produce exactly that reaction. You think you're fighting for justice, but you're actually performing in a drama where your emotional investment serves someone else's strategic goals. The anatomy of manufactured outrage is simple and elegant. First, identify what people care about: their values, their fears, their unresolved pain. Second, create situations that trigger those emotional responses. Third, provide acceptable targets for the resulting anger. Fourth, channel that anger into actions that serve your objectives while making the angry person feel righteous and empowered. Fifth, repeat the cycle until the emotional responses become habitual, automatic, predictable. You've been trained to react, not to think. You've been conditioned to feel, not to analyze. You've been programmed to respond to emotional cues with immediate intensity, bypassing the rational evaluation that might reveal the strings being pulled. Your outrage has become a renewable resource that others harvest on demand, the most insidious. Control happens when you believe your rebellion was your idea. When you're convinced that your resistance is authentic, your dissent is genuine, your anger is justified. You never suspect that your rebellion was anticipated. Your dissent was planned for. Your anger was factored into the equation before you even knew there was an equation. You think you're fighting the system, but you're actually performing a role within it, the role of the rebel, the dissenter, the angry voice of opposition that makes the system appear responsive, dynamic, legitimate. The controllers understand that people need to feel like they're resisting something. They need to believe they have agency, that their voices matter, that their actions can create change. So the smart controllers don't suppress this need, they manage it. They provide acceptable forms of rebellion, sanctioned expressions of dissent, approved methods of resistance. They let you feel powerful while ensuring your power serves their purposes. You march in protests that change nothing. You sign petitions that disappear into digital void. You vote for candidates who implement the same policies regardless of their party affiliation. You boycott companies that profit from your boycott through increased attention and tribal loyalty from their true customer base. You think you're fighting back, but you're actually participating in a system designed to absorb and neutralize your resistance, while making you feel like you've accomplished something meaningful. True power whispers while weakness screams. This is perhaps the most important lesson you'll never learn until you stop listening to the noise and start paying attention to the silence. You've been conditioned to mistake volume for influence, drama for importance, visibility for power. But the real shapers of your world operate from positions of strategic invisibility. The people who control the narrative don't need to announce themselves. They don't need your attention, your approval, or your acknowledgement. They simply shape the conditions within which you make your choices, influence the context that determines your options, and create the framework that defines what's possible and what's unthinkable. They don't need to convince you of anything. They just need to control the environment in which your convictions form. You focus on the loudest voices, the most dramatic personalities, the most visible conflicts. You pay attention to those who perform power rather than those who possess it. You watch the puppets dance while the puppeteers remain invisible, pulling strings from positions of strategic anonymity. You debate about who's in charge while the people who are actually in charge remain unnamed, unnoticed, unexamined. The narrative. Controllers understand that those who must announce their authority have already lost it. Real power doesn't need to prove itself. It simply reshapes reality according to its will. It doesn't need to argue. It creates the conditions within which all arguments take place. It doesn't need to win debates. It determines what can be debated and what must remain unquestioned. You're learning, slowly and painfully, to recognize the difference between performed power and actual power. Performed power seeks your attention, your validation, your emotional investment. It needs you to care, to react, to participate in its drama. Actual power already owns your choices before you know you're making them. It shapes your preferences before you know you have them. It influences your decisions before you realize there's a decision to be made. The silence before the storm isn't empty, it's pregnant with potential, heavy with unstated power, thick with unannounced authority. Those who understand this silence don't need to fill it with noise. They simply wait, knowing that their patience is itself a form of power. Their restraint is itself a kind of control. Your worldview isn't a personal philosophy developed through careful thought and lived experience. It's a carefully constructed mental prison where the bars are made of your own convictions, the walls are built from your own beliefs, and the lock is forged from your own certainty. You defend ideas you never chose, repeat phrases you never questioned, and feel passionate about causes that serve interests you never examined. The architecture of belief systems is more sophisticated than any physical prison, because it makes the prisoner believe they're free. It creates cells that feel like sanctuaries, limitations that feel like choices, control that feels like autonomy. The most effective beliefs are those that make questioning them feel like betrayal of your values, your community, your very identity. You didn't choose your political affiliations through careful analysis of policy outcomes. You inherited them from your social environment, adopted them to fit in with your preferred tribal identity, and then rationalized them with whatever arguments felt most compelling. You didn't develop your moral framework through philosophical inquiry and ethical reasoning. You absorbed it from cultural messaging, social pressure, and a deep human need to be seen as good by those whose opinions matter to you. The most sophisticated form of control makes you the warden of your own limitations. It convinces you that your constraints are choices, that your programming is personality, that your conditioning is character. It makes you believe that challenging your fundamental assumptions would be dangerous, disloyal, or destructive. It transforms your curiosity into anxiety, your questioning into guilt, your skepticism into betrayal. You police your own thoughts before any external authority needs to intervene. You censor your own questions before any outside force needs to silence you. You limit your own possibilities before any system needs to constrain you. The prison has no guards because the prisoners have been convinced they're the guards, protecting themselves and others from the dangerous freedom that exists beyond the walls they've learned to love. Every passionate conviction you hold serves someone's strategic purpose. Every moral certainty you possess benefits someone's political agenda. Every emotional investment you make feeds someone's economic interest. But you never ask whose purpose, whose agenda, whose interest. You just feel the passion, embrace the certainty, make the investment, and call it authenticity. The most influential people in your life are those whose influence you don't recognize. They shape your choices without you knowing they exist. They determine your options without appearing on any ballot. They control your future without ever asking for your permission. The most powerful decisions affecting your life are made by people whose names you'll never know, in rooms you'll never enter, through processes you'll never understand. You focus on the visible players in the game of power, the politicians, the celebrities, the public figures who capture your attention and trigger your emotions. But these are just the performers, the faces, the voices that give the illusion of human agency to systems that operate according to their own inexorable logic. The real power lies with those who create the systems, define the rules, establish the parameters within which all the visible drama takes place. Strategic invisibility is the highest form of influence. It allows power to operate without resistance, because resistance requires a visible target. It enables control without rebellion, because rebellion needs something concrete to rebel against. It facilitates manipulation without awareness, because awareness needs something specific to be aware of. The unseen hand doesn't guide events, it creates the conditions within which events unfold according to predictable patterns. It doesn't control people, it shapes the environment in which people make choices that feel free but follow predetermined paths. It doesn't impose outcomes, it establishes the framework that makes certain outcomes inevitable while maintaining the illusion that other outcomes were possible. You live in a world where the most important decisions are made by a committee of people you've never heard of, implementing policies you never voted for, serving interests you're not meant to understand. The democracy you participate in is theater. The choices you make are from a menu written by others. The freedom you cherish is carefully managed, strategically limited, systematically channeled toward ends that were decided before you were born. Real power doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. It simply shapes the world while others debate about who's shaping it. It creates reality while others argue about how to interpret reality. It determines the future while others fight about what the future should look like. You've been trained to follow charismatic performers rather than competent strategists, to choose leaders based on how they make you feel rather than what they can achieve. The narrative of democratic choice has devolved into a popularity contest where the most manipulative actors win by appealing to your emotions while the true architects of change work behind the scenes, unburdened by the need for your approval or even your awareness. Authentic leadership based on competence, vision, and the ability to navigate complex realities toward beneficial outcomes has been replaced by performative leadership that prioritizes appearance over substance, messaging over results, emotional satisfaction over strategic success. You vote for people who make you feel good about yourself rather than people who can actually solve problems. You support candidates who validate your existing beliefs rather than those who challenge you to think more clearly about complex issues. The death of authentic leadership isn't just a political phenomenon, it's a cultural transformation that reflects deeper changes in how power operates in modern society. When leadership becomes performance, when authority becomes entertainment, when governance becomes theater, the real power necessarily moves elsewhere. It migrates to less visible positions, operates through less obvious mechanisms, achieves its goals through more subtle methods. You're presented with leaders who are essentially actors reading scripts written by others, implementing policies developed by people you never elected, serving interests that were never part of any campaign platform. The democratic process has become a legitimizing ritual that provides the illusion of choice while ensuring that the fundamental direction of society remains unchanged regardless of who wins. The most successful political actors aren't those with the best ideas or the strongest principles. They're those who can most effectively perform the role of leader, while actually serving as puppets for systems and interests that operate beyond the reach of democratic accountability. They're rewarded not for their competence, but for their compliance, not for their vision, but for their willingness to advance agendas they didn't create and may not even understand. Behind the scenes, real power continues to consolidate, real decisions continue to be made. Real control continues to be exercised by those who understand that visibility is often the enemy of influence, that public attention is frequently a distraction from private action, that democratic theater serves authoritarian purposes better than authoritarian theater ever could. The tragedy isn't that democracy has failed. It's that it has succeeded too well at accomplishing purposes it was never meant to serve, while failing completely at the purposes it was supposedly designed to achieve. You stand at the threshold between being a character in someone else's story and becoming the author of your own narrative. This isn't a comfortable position. It requires you to abandon the illusion of innocence that has protected you from the weight of responsibility. It demands that you give up the comfortable fiction that others are responsible for your circumstances, your choices, your outcomes. The choice before you isn't between good and evil. Those are categories created by others to limit your strategic thinking. The choice is between conscious influence and unconscious manipulation, between deliberate action and reactive behavior, between strategic thinking and emotional response. You can continue to be moved by forces you don't understand, shaped by influences you don't recognize, controlled by systems you refuse to examine. Or you can learn to move others with the same strategic precision that was once used against you. Awakening isn't about becoming evil or abandoning your values. It's about understanding that your values are meaningless unless you possess the power to implement them, that your principles are irrelevant unless you have the strategic capability to advance them, that your good intentions are worthless unless you understand how to make them effective in a world that operates according to its own harsh logic. The transition from audience to author requires you to accept several uncomfortable truths. First, that the world doesn't care about your good intentions. It only responds to effective action. Second, That being right is less important than being strategic. Rightness without power is just noise. Third, that your moral purity is luxury you can afford only if others are willing to pay the cost of maintaining it for you. You must learn to think like those who have been thinking about you strategically, systematically, with clear objectives and measurable outcomes. You must develop the capacity to influence others with the same sophistication that others have used to influence you. You must understand the mechanisms of power well enough to wield them consciously rather than being wielded by them unconsciously. This doesn't mean becoming manipulative in the crude sense. It means becoming effective in the sophisticated sense. It means learning to achieve your goals through understanding human psychology, social dynamics, and strategic communication rather than through force, deception, or emotional manipulation. It means becoming powerful enough to protect your values, rather than naive enough to see them destroyed by those who understand power better than you do. Your transformation from naive participant to strategic player begins with the recognition that morality without power is impotent and power without strategy is chaos. This isn't a cynical observation, it's a practical necessity. In a world where others play by strategic rules, your moral rigidity becomes a liability not just to yourself, but to everyone who depends on you, everyone who shares your values, everyone who would benefit from your success. You're not abandoning your values, you're learning to advance them through methods that actually work in the real world rather than methods that make you feel virtuous while accomplishing nothing. You're not becoming amoral, you're becoming effective. You're not losing your humanity, you're gaining the strategic capability to protect and promote what makes you human. The mask of legitimacy becomes your tool, rather than your prison, when you understand how to wear it consciously rather than unconsciously. When you recognize that all power requires some form of legitimizing narrative, some story that makes its exercise acceptable to those who are subject to it. When you grasp that the choice isn't between power and morality, but between conscious power and unconscious power, between strategic power and reactive power, between power used for purposes you choose and power used against purposes you value, you learn to speak the language of legitimacy while serving objectives that transcend the limitations of that language. You master the forms of democratic participation while understanding the realities of how change actually happens. You develop the ability to work within systems while maintaining clarity about those systems' limitations and contradictions. The new sovereignty isn't about dominating others, it's about refusing to be dominated by forces you don't understand or influences you haven't chosen. It's about becoming the kind of person who shapes events rather than merely responding to them, who creates opportunities rather than waiting for them, who influences outcomes rather than simply accepting them. This sovereignty is earned through understanding, maintained through strategy, and expressed through the conscious choice to think and act from a position of strength rather than weakness, clarity rather than confusion, purpose rather than reactivity. It's the difference between being subject to the narrative and being author of the narrative, between being moved by the story and creating the story, between living according to scripts written by others and writing your own script for others to follow. You rise not through the destruction of others, but through the construction of yourself into something that cannot be used, cannot be manipulated, cannot be controlled by those who profit from your unconsciousness. You become dangerous not through violence, but through awareness, not through aggression, but through strategic thinking, not through domination, but through the refusal to be dominated. The game continues, but you're no longer just a piece on the board. You understand the rules well enough to play consciously, the patterns well enough to influence outcomes, the psychology well enough to protect your interests while advancing your values. You've learned to wear the mask of legitimacy not as a prisoner wears chains, but as a sovereign wears a crown, consciously, strategically, in service of purposes you've chosen rather than purposes that have chosen you. The narrative is yours now. Use it wisely.